So thank you very much for that. So just to follow up on a couple of points that Justin was talking about. First, there was an article with regard to healthcare costs, as he was referring to. So a growing number of retirees say healthcare costs take up to 1/2 of their Social Security. The portion of the Social Security benefits that retirees spend on Medicare premiums and out-of-pockets climbed in 2018 for a growing number of retirees, according to the Senior League. About 30% of retirees say the premium out-of-pocket spending consumed 1/3 to 1/2 of their Social Security benefits. Represents a 7 percentage point increase, up from 23% in 2017. This year, it's expected that the Medicare Part B is roughly $134 a month. For the Medicare trustees for next year, they estimate that it will go to $135.50 for 2019. So remember, in Medicare, there is a hold harmless provision that says that they cannot increase Medicare premiums more than what they increase the COLA on Social Security and therefore it. So obviously they're expecting an increase in Social Security payments. There was an increase in Social Security payments this year. The average person got to keep about $5 of it. The rest of it, basically, it all went to it went from Social Security to Medicare and therefore it. So the other question was that most retirees have Medicare premiums, Medigap, and Medicare Part D. The Advantage plans, the Medigap premiums have increased 158% since 2000, and out-of-pocket spending on prescription drugs have increased by 188%. So with those particular increases, we talked about inflation, right? You're talking about what a dollar buys and how much you have for it. If you've had a 188% increase in your out-of-pocket for it, that would be what they call inflation, right? So where are those extra dollars coming from, if that's the case for it? Because obviously that reduced the spendable income from your Social Security or from your pension or something along those lines for it, right? So the other part, one of the things that talking about colleges and with regard to information and that for it, as soon as they turn 18, not only can you not get medical information, you cannot get information on grades, right? So when my oldest son went to Vanderbilt actually made them sign something to say that the parents could actually get access to all of that information if we wanted it. It was not as fortunate at University of Illinois nor at University of Washington where my girls went that there was a requirement that they had to provide that information, right? So if you're looking at getting a healthcare power, it's also suggested that you get a power of attorney for property that would allow you to get access to that information as well, all right? With regard to 529 accounts that he was referring to, there's been a change in the tax law effective July 1st of this year. Now you can use 529 accounts for from K through 12. So if you, instead of having to use that money only for college, you can now use it for K through 12 up to $10,000. So for example, I'm sorry?
Sorry, you know, they had another college fund and it went bankrupt or went belly up or something and people lost a lot of money in that?
There were some prepaid college programs where they had bought, you had bought bonds, and the bonds were supposed to be able to pay for college when your son or daughter went to that university. In the small print on those documents, what it said was that if you put money into the plan and the plan was not solid enough to pay out, they would pay you a nominal interest rate on that money you invested. So for example, let's say you put $20,000 into these prepaid plans and it was supposed to buy you 4 years of college at, just use University of Illinois as an example for it, right? What would happen would be is that they said that those bonds weren't able to pay off. What they would do is basically give you your $20,000 back plus roughly a 2% interest rate on it for 10 years, which obviously would not be enough to compensate for what you thought you were going to be able to do with it. So I'm not a big proponent of those, just simply because there are situations. I believe about 10 years ago, Colorado had a situation with it where people thought they were going to have enough money to pay for school, and then it turns out that they didn't, because they changed in the bond structure and that for it. The 529 accounts that are run by companies like Putnam and others and that for it, those are strictly kind of an investment area for it, right? So those are really good because you do have access to it, you have control over some of the proceeds. You can contribute up to $70,000 in 1 year, in the first year of those plans, to make sure to jumpstart some things. The other part of those assets, which not necessarily as important today as what it was, is once you make those gifts, and those are considered a completed gift after the 5 years, it's outside of your estate. But as the owner of the plan, you still own the money. Right? It's still yours. It's not your grandsons, granddaughters, or your sons or daughters at that point. So if they're a knucklehead and they don't do something you like, you don't have to use the money for that. And then they're also transferable, meaning that you can change successor, you can change beneficiaries on it from one child to another child. Some accounts you can split the children out if there's funds. There's a lot of flexibility that can go into those plans, and they can be used for everything. I've had clients who've used them for HVAC school. I've had clients who've used them for masters, medical school, undergraduate, and now in addition it's being added for grammar school and grammar school and high school. So it can help people who do want to send their children to private schools and that for it. If you want to go to Mother McCullough's or Brother Rice or something like that, you now could use potentially those proceeds to be able to fund those accounts and that for it, right? The other part, one question that was coming up with regard to your planning for retirement and with regard to beneficiaries and that for it, if you have not done a beneficiary review, it is a good time to do that. You're coming near the end of the year and that for it. If you do have IRA accounts or qualified type of accounts, having a primary beneficiary, let's say being your spouse and that for it. If you do have children or want to put contingents, I always suggest that there is a contingent listed on there in case something, God forbid, would happen to both the owner and the primary beneficiary and that for it. It could be advisable for you to have a trust as the successor, as a contingent beneficiary. If you do that, you want to make sure it has language in there that provides for it to do a conduit IRA, which means that the asset is now a protected asset, meaning that right now there's a Supreme Court ruling about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, which basically said that a beneficiary IRA account is not considered a protected asset because the owner of it cannot contribute to it. So as example, when my dad passed, I didn't need the money, didn't want to pay tax on the money, so I've set up a beneficiary IRA account on it. Previous to the Supreme Court ruling, that was considered a protected asset. If I got sued, someone couldn't go after it. If I got divorced, my ex-wife couldn't get part of it. That all changed about 5-6 years ago, and the Supreme Court ruled that is not a protected asset. What they ruled basically was that I chose to not have to pay the taxes at one point in time, so therefore it was more of a financial situation, not necessarily a protected asset. The way to get potentially around that is if you have language and you have a trust, and the trust has a conduit IRA in there for it, allows those assets to now be protected assets, meaning that if they are sued, if their marriage does dissolve or that forth, that they still do not have to give up those assets and that forth. Yes?
Subject to beneficiary, can the person with power of attorney change beneficiary designations?
So the question is, can a power of attorney change beneficiary designations? It's a yes/no answer. Yes, they can if it is on the paperwork that will allow them to change the beneficiaries. So a lot of times when you create a power of attorney, it'll ask, do you want them to be able to do other functions in that for it? One of the functions that you can write in there is that you can say, I want them to be able to update beneficiaries or that for me. Because if you get incapacitated and you can't do it, but let's say something happens in the family or that, and you want to make that change, you might not be able to do it, but you would potentially allow your power of attorney to. So you want to be cautious with who you give that to, obviously, for it. And then if it's not written in there, then the power of attorney cannot make those changes. So it depends on if it's written in the document or not for it.
When you said incapacitated, what about if they are and they need a guardianship? How does that differ from power?
So the question is regarding guardianship or power of attorney. Guardianship is generally issued through the courts. So you're going to the court to petition for guardianship. Sometimes it starts with like the Department of Aging and that for it, and then they escalate it up and it goes into a guardianship position, and then you get a legal document that says you're guardian. Typically, if you get a guardianship document, you will have to keep track of all transactions. and have to provide an annual statement to the court to show that the funds that you've used for this particular person, and given basically an accounting record of everything for it, right? They want to make sure that all the funds that you've used, because you're the guardian, if you have access to this, they want to make sure that you're part of it. So that is a difference in a power of attorney. Power of attorney generally is not required with which to keep track of as detailed of documents. You may want to keep track of them just for accounting purposes, but it's not necessarily a requirement in that for it. One of the other questions, I got a question the other day about with regard to reducing expenses in that for it. It had to do with regard to their home equity line of credit for it. Equity lines of credit may be increasing in their interest rates in that for it, since the Federal Reserve has increased rates. Mine last year started out at 4. When I refinanced this year, it was up to 5.5 in that for it. I was recently in a bank and saw that they were starting at 5.75 for it. So interest rates on those home equity lines of credit have gone up. So you want to make sure that you're managing that to see if those go up for it. The other part of it is to understand what your home equity line of credit and how it works. So home equity lines of credit typically are, let's say, 20 years in length, and they are interest-only payments that are required for it. Meaning at the end of the 20 years, if you should have a balance that's due, they will either want the whole balance paid off. So if you've got $20,000 on it, they want the $20,000 paid off. Or what they will do is allow you typically to refinance that $20,000 over another 10 or 20 year period of time. So what you want to understand is how long is your equity line. If you have one, you say, oh, I've got it. I've got one on my account. I've had one for years, and therefore that may be fine. But you want to understand how much longer that line will last. Is it for 2 years? Is it for 10 years? Is it for 3 years? Because if you plan on buying something or you need to use it for something, and all of a sudden now it turns out that it's due the next year, you may be in a situation where you're not necessarily prepared with what to come up with. Let's say you had to put your new roof on the house and furnace, and let's say it was $10,000 or $15,000. You may not have that $10,000 or $15,000 with which to pay back immediately, and that for it, right? So you want to just understand how they work. I do usually recommend that if people are going into retirement, before they actually go to retirement, they actually get a line of credit, and that for it, even if you're not planning on using it, because you can get it while you're still working, and they'll use your working history in that to be able to qualify you for the credit. They don't ask once you're retired if you know what your income in that portion is going to be, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
One thing on that, with new tax bills, you can't write off the interest anymore.
The question is about being able to write off the interest for it. The answer is yes. You are not, unless I believe you can prove that it was used for a home improvement. If you can prove through your accountant in that most likely would only come through an audit at that point for it, to be able to say that you actually used it for putting on a new roof, let's say in there, right? But if you do that, you may open up yourself subject to more of a audit purpose for it, and the amount of the interest that you potentially would save for it may not be worth what's there for. But for most cases, a lot of people do use them for other purposes, and therefore pay for college, or therefore those are no longer deductible. So it's a big change in the tax law with regard to it.
But when you use a line of credit, don't you could eat into your savings and just trying to pay it back because you were retired. So you're not generating any money except retirement.
So the question was, if you have a line of credit, could you potentially, erode your savings? And the answer is yes, because if you don't have additional funds to pay that interest back or even a potential principal with it, then that money's coming from somewhere, and you kind of get in the debt spiral where now you're paying and you're losing more money because you just don't have the cash available for it, right? If you think of mentioned about inflation, right? Inflation's been running about 2%, or obviously we saw for what they were saying from 2000 to 2017 with regard to a 188% increase in that for it. If inflation's running at 2%, you need to have a net income or net increase of interest or return of greater than 2% to make sure that you're at least keeping pace with inflation. All right. So if you have a savings account or that for it, and it's earning, pick a number, 0.5% and that for it, right? Well, that's 1.5% net, because you have to pay tax on that interest that you've earned in your savings account, right? So now instead of earning, $20, maybe you only earn $15 after you pay taxes and that on it, right? So now you're not 1.5% behind just keeping pace with inflation. You're now closer probably to maybe 1.8% behind keeping pace with that 2% figure, right? So we need to earn, let's say, 3% so that we're netting down to 2% to make sure that we're just keeping pace with those inflation dollars for it. Anybody have their property taxes increased over the last year? All right. Would you say that was an inflation factor? All right. So you are aware, so those people who live in Chicago, there was, when they passed through the city council, I think last year, that said that CPS can raise taxes at any point in time that they want, property taxes, with which to fill budget gaps. And it does not, it does not have to go through any of the aldermen, anything to vote on, right? Last week I was having lunch with an attorney who teaches a class in public financing, and we were talking just about pensions. As you're aware, my wife's a teacher, so we were talking about like TRS and the funding for it. Well, I was not aware of this, and I haven't confirmed it, but he told me that right now in bonds that they issue to fund the pensions in that for it, it's not really known, but it's part of it. There is a caveat in there that says that the bondholders, if they cannot pay the interest back to the bondholders, that the bondholders have the ability with which to raise property taxes to meet the obligations. Which means if it's a state-funded pension, that they could raise property taxes across the state to pay for those pensions. He told me about it. I haven't been able to research it that. If that is indeed the case, he said that's what happened in Detroit. When the bondholders took over and Detroit went into receivership, they said, okay, raise property taxes. Well, nobody lives in Detroit, so they couldn't raise, 100% of zero gives you still zero, right? So basically at that point in time, they were forced with which to renegotiate their bond portion for it. Yes?
Can you explain this again about IRA? Say a husband and wife, he has an IRA account, to pay to put it into a trust, what you said?
No, so what the question was about having the setting up the trust on it. So an IRA account has to remain as an IRA account. It's an individual retirement account for either yourself or you and your wife, or that for it. It's regard to the beneficiaries. So typically if it's a husband and wife situation, it'll be husband's beneficiary primary for the wives and the wife's the primary for the husbands. Correct, right? It's when you get into the contingent beneficiaries for it, instead of just potentially listing your children, Susie, John, and Jane, right? You actually have a trust as the beneficiary. And then what happens is you have language in the trust which creates a conduit IRA account, which in the trust it says to now create 3 separate, let's say, beneficiary IRA accounts for your children at that point in time. But because the trust is the conduit, and the trust becomes a way to protect the assets from outside influences at that point. Okay, so the trust doesn't own the IRA at that point in time. The trust is the beneficiary of the IRA account.
But if you leave a beneficiary, can the beneficiary turn it over to an IRA?
The question is, if you leave it to a beneficiary, an individual, can the beneficiary turn it over to an IRA account? Well, they can create what's called a beneficiary IRA or a stretch IRA account for it. It's still essentially your IRA account, but they are a beneficiary for it. All right, so now they're able, from a tax standpoint, able to take those distributions over 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on their life expectancy and that forth, right? So it just becomes a way to be able to maybe protect it more. If you have it going to an individual, then those assets become what would be considered kind of a judgmentable asset that they could go after if they got in a divorce of that for it. The ex-spouse could potentially get half of that asset as well for it. So, one area with regard, there was a question brought up about Roth IRA accounts and that for it, or Roth and doing a Roth 401k for it. So on the Roth portion of it, the concern potentially I have probably about 10 years from now, that'll be when the Gen Xers will be starting to get closer toward retirement and that for it. Most baby boomers in that have put their money into traditional IRAs or traditional 401ks where they got the tax deduction and that for it. About 10 years from now would be when the Gen Xers will start getting ready for their retirement portion. The concern I have about it is, how is the government going to pay for government services if the money that comes out of the Roth accounts, they don't pay any tax on? Right? So I don't know how many dollars, there's trillions of dollars in Roth accounts right now for it. If all of a sudden those money start to come out of Roth accounts, how does somebody collect, or where do they collect tax from if there's a tax-free distribution? And that for it, right? So just something to potentially consider when you're looking at down the road. Yes?
Could you explain the system again? You mentioned the system.
Systematic.
Yes.
So the question was regarding like systematic investment in that for it. So systematic investment would be something you would doing basically on a monthly type basis or a weekly basis or that for it. So every month you say, I'm going to take $100, $500, whatever the number is, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it into an investment area, right? So if there are now each month there's $500 that's coming out, and each month you're going in. It's also referred to as dollar cost averaging for it, because when you're putting that $500 in, if you're buying something in the market for it, today it may be worth $10, next month maybe it's worth $9.50, and the next month it's worth $11. So you're buying more or less shares depending on what the value of that for. But it's something systematic. You get into a habit of basically doing it, right? So it's easier to implement and just keep on going, right? Clients I usually recommend with that is to start something small and increase it over time, as opposed to starting out big and then reducing, because what I've seen over the years is that someone will say, oh, I know I can do, pick a number, $1,000 a month. Well, they do it for 2 months and they go, what was I thinking? I can't do this. Is crazy. So they just stop it all. And then the worst part is they never start up again, all right? So now it becomes easier not to do it than it is to keep kind of doing it. It's kind of like the exercise program, right? You know, you run the marathon, but you haven't learned to walk around the block yet, right? And then you go, I'm never going to exercise again because I can't do the marathon, right? So, yes?
So the systematic is done through a financial agent like you?
Right, you can set it up for it depending on how you want to set the structure of the investment or that going forward on. Okay. So the other part on it, we were talking just a little bit earlier. Someone had a question about the market's looking where they're continuing to grow in that for it. And one of the areas on it right now is you still have a lot of cash on the sidelines for it. A tremendous amount of cash is sitting there. It has not been reinvested since 2008. Excuse me. The concern that you probably see when you'll know the markets are ready to kind of turn over, is when all of a sudden all that money starts to move in to the markets for it, right? Because that means that everybody thinks now it's time to make money, even though the money, so to speak, may have already been made at that point. So it's good to just kind of keep an eye on it, good to do a review. The other part also, just mentioned with regard to sustainable income forces, right? So over the last 30 years, we watch interest rates go down, which means that if you're relying on fixed income assets, then a lot of times that interest that you're earning is also come down with it. Just remember, dividends are not guaranteed, right? So dividends companies can pay dividends. They are not required to pay dividends, right? It could affect the company stock price if they don't, but you can't necessarily just rely that you're always going to get that dividend for it, or they could potentially cut dividends. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at income sources, that it's sources that are going to be sustainable, to make sure that that money is always coming in, right? Why do you like your pension? Why do you like your Social Security or that for it? It's because you know on the first of the month or that for it, there's always, pick a number, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, whatever, coming into your account, right? And so you want to make sure that the income you have is sustainable. If healthcare costs, with life expectancy going up in that for it, you have healthcare costs that are continue to increase for it. How do you make sure that you're able to continue to pay those costs? You got an increase in your property taxes. Well, if you got an increase in your property taxes, your income didn't go up enough to cover all of that property tax increase, where are those additional dollars going to come from? They may come from your savings, right? Well, if they come from your savings account and that for it, and you're not earning enough in your savings account to cover that cost for it, then what's going to happen to your savings account? It's going to go down, because over time you're going to have to take more out of it. And you have to remember, it's not the percentage that you're necessarily earning on the account, because if you're earning 3% and you have $100,000 in the account, if you earn 3% the next year but you only have $95,000 in your account, your net dollars that you earned are going to be less, right? You still made the same percentage. The percentage return was the same, but last time I checked, when you went to the bank didn't say what's your percentage for the year. They asked how many dollars are you depositing in, right? So they want to know the actual deposit, not the interest for it. So if you get in that situation, and then the following year you're down to, let's say, $90,000 for it, and you still earn 3%, great, you earn 3%, but now you're $5,000 less in your account. So you get caught, so to speak, in the debt spiral in that for it. For planning purposes right now, we're supposed to plan out, because one of two spouses most likely will live to be into their 90s. And if that's the case for it, then we have to plan out for, let's say, a 30-year retirement area. With interest rates being this low on a distribution basis, we're supposed to be using around a 2 to 3% distribution rate for it, and that's on a net basis. So that takes into account taxes and everything else. So on a gross basis, that could be 4.5% that we've got to at least earn to net down enough to be able to cover that 3% for the rest of your life. Okay. Any questions? Well, if there are any questions, thank you very much for coming. Have yourselves a great day. Try and avoid the rain, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Sure. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.